May 8, 1944. 30 miles off the Norwegian coast, the cold North Sea churns beneath a grey, overcast sky. Lieutenant Blith Ritchie tightens his grip on the stick of his Grumman F6F Hellcat as bogies appear at 2 o'clock high. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 5, vectoring in fast. The Germans have the altitude advantage, the experience advantage, and aircraft purpose-built for this exact kind of fight. Ritchie's Hellcat is thousands of miles from its natural hunting grounds in the Pacific, facing enemies it was never designed to meet. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The lead Focke-Wulf rolls into its attack run. The German pilot has done this dance dozens of times before over the Eastern Front and the skies of Germany. He knows his 190 can outdive, outroll, and quite possibly outgun the American fighter below. What he doesn't know, what he cannot know in these final seconds of his life, is that this particular Hellcat pilot is about to introduce him to a very specific mathematical problem, a problem measured in fractions of seconds and solved by 6 wing-mounted Browning machine guns that together can put more than 70 rounds into the air every single second. The German commits to his dive. Ritchie waits. Not yet, not yet. 400 yards. The magic number drilled into every Navy fighter pilot's head. The distance where the 50 caliber Browning's ballistic trajectory intersects perfectly with the average deflection angle of an attacking fighter. The distance where 12 seconds of concentrated fire becomes a death sentence wrapped in copper-jacketed lead. Ritchie's fingers find the trigger. The Hellcat shudders as all 6 guns open up simultaneously, and the Focke-Wulf disintegrates in a ball of orange flame before the German pilot can even process what happened. This is the story of a weapons system so devastatingly effective that it rewrote the rules of air combat in both theatres of World War II. A story about how American engineers took a proven machine gun design, multiplied it by 6, and created a flying gun platform that could deliver more lethal firepower in a 2-second burst than most fighters could manage in 10. But more than that, it's the story of the 12 seconds a German pilot had to kill a Hellcat before those 6 Brownings turned his aircraft into scrap metal falling toward the ocean below. The foundation of American air power, January 1942. Pearl Harbor's smoking ruins are barely 2 months cold when Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation's chief test pilot rolls the F6F prototype onto the runway at Bethpage, Long Island. The United States Navy has issued a very specific requirement. They need a carrier fighter that can hunt down and destroy the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that has just spent the past 2 months demonstrating air superiority across the entire Pacific theater. But more than speed or maneuverability, the Navy wants killing power. The lesson from early Pacific combat is brutal and unambiguous. You can out-turn a Zero. You can out-climb a Zero. But if you can't destroy it quickly when you have the shot, the lightweight Japanese fighter will slip away, reset the engagement, and come back with its own guns blazing. The F4F Wildcat, the Navy's current frontline fighter, carries 6 50 caliber machine guns. It's a proven arrangement, but combat reports suggest it's barely adequate. Zeros are absorbing burst after burst and flying home with holes you could put your fist through. The Navy wants more guns. Bigger guns, something to ensure that when a pilot gets a firing solution, the target doesn't survive the experience. Grumman's designers face a fundamental constraint. You can't just bolt more weapons onto an aircraft without consequences. Every gun adds weight. Every round of ammunition adds more weight. The structural reinforcement to handle recoil adds still more weight. And weight is the enemy of everything that makes a fighter aircraft effective. Speed, climb rate, maneuverability, range. All of it degrades as mass increases. The engineers have to find the perfect balance between firepower and flight performance, between hitting power and hitting back. The solution they develop will become one of the most lethal weapon systems ever mounted on a single-engine fighter. 6 Browning AN M2. 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, each feeding from a 400-round ammunition box. Total ammunition capacity, 2,400 rounds. Total weight of fire, approximately 180 pounds of projectiles that could be delivered downrange in under 30 seconds of continuous shooting. But raw numbers don't tell the full story. The real genius lies in what John Moses Browning's design could do to an aircraft at combat ranges. The Browning M2 machine gun entered service in 1921 as a vehicle-mounted heavy machine gun. By the 1930s, Army and Navy engineers had developed a lighter, faster-firing aircraft variant designated the ANM-2. AN stood for Army-Navy, reflecting the joint procurement that was unusual for the era. The aviation version traded the heavy barrel of the ground gun for a lighter 36-inch barrel, cooled by slipstream airflow at altitude. This modification reduced weight from 84 pounds to 61 pounds per gun, and simultaneously increased the rate of fire from around 500 rounds per minute to between 750 and 850 rounds per minute. That increase in firing rate wasn't cosmetic. It was fundamental to air combat effectiveness. Fighter pilots measured their firing opportunities in seconds, sometimes fractions of seconds. An enemy aircraft would flash through your gun sight, you'd hammer the trigger, and either you'd see strikes or you wouldn't. The difference between 750 rounds per minute and 500 rounds per minute meant the difference between putting 12 rounds into a target versus 8 rounds in the same firing window. In aerial combat, those 4 extra rounds per gun meant 24 extra projectiles across all 6 weapons. Often, those extra rounds were the difference between damage and destruction. The 50 BMG cartridge, standing for Browning machine gun, was itself a masterpiece of ballistic engineering. 5.5 inches long from base to bullet tip, propelling a 700-grain projectile at approximately 2,800 feet per second. The round came in multiple variants: ball ammunition for general-purpose use, armor-piercing rounds with hardened steel cores capable of punching through 3/4 of an inch of steel plate at 500 yards, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that combined penetration with an explosive charge that ignited on impact, and tracer rounds loaded with pyrotechnic compounds that burned bright enough to track in daylight, creating the visible stream of fire seen in gun camera footage. The armor-piercing incendiary round, designated API, became the preferred combat loading for fighter aircraft. Every 5th round in the ammunition belt was a tracer, creating a visual reference for the pilot, while the other 4 delivered killing power. The API round didn't just punch holes, it set things on fire: fuel tanks, hydraulic lines, ammunition storage, engine components. The incendiary charge, though small, proved devastatingly effective against aircraft filled with flammable liquids and built from lightweight materials, prioritizing performance over protection. By June 1942, the first production F6F Hellcats were rolling off Grumman's assembly line. The aircraft that emerged was purpose-built around its armament. The 6 Brownings were mounted in the wings, 3 per side, clustered together in groups to concentrate fire. Mounting guns in the wings rather than the fuselage created its own challenges. Wing-mounted weapons experienced more vibration during firing, reducing accuracy. The spacing between guns meant that their convergence pattern had to be carefully calculated, with armourers adjusting each gun's angle so all 6 streams of fire intersected at a predetermined range. Most Hellcat squadrons set their gun convergence at 400 yards. This wasn't arbitrary. 400 yards represented the optimal compromise between several competing factors. Closer than 400 yards, and the convergence pattern was too tight, creating a small, beaten zone that required precise aim. Farther than 400 yards, and the 6 separate bullet streams spread too wide, reducing hit probability. At 400 yards, a properly harmonized Hellcat created a cone of fire approximately 6 feet in diameter, large enough to ensure strikes on a maneuvering target, concentrated enough to guarantee lethal damage. The installation included features designed specifically for reliability in combat conditions. Each gun had its own ammunition feed system with a 400-round capacity, ensuring that a single jam wouldn't disable multiple weapons. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ammunition boxes were positioned inboard of the guns, keeping weight close to the fuselage centerline for better handling characteristics. Electric primers meant the guns could be fired through a remote solenoid trigger integrated into the control stick, faster and more reliable than mechanical linkages. Spent cartridges ejected downward through ports in the wing's underside, preventing fouling of control surfaces. Gun heating was addressed through careful integration with the aircraft's design. At altitude, where temperatures routinely dropped below zero, the slipstream cooling proved more than adequate. During extended ground fire or combat at low altitude, the barrels would heat up, but the Hellcat's tactical doctrine rarely involved sustained fire at single targets. Pilots were trained to fire in short bursts, typically 1 to 3 seconds, allowing barrels to cool between engagements. This burst fire technique also conserved ammunition, a critical consideration given that 2,400 rounds sounds like a lot until you realize it represents roughly 20 seconds of continuous fire across all 6 guns. The Hellcat's fire control system was deceptively simple by modern standards. A reflector gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a glass plate in front of the pilot's eyes. The pilot adjusted a dial to input the wingspan of his target aircraft, typically set for the Zero's 39-foot span. The reticle would then display a circle that, when the target filled it precisely, indicated proper range and deflection for a killing shot. This was pure optical analog computing, no electronics, no radar ranging, just carefully calculated geometry and the pilot's ability to judge distance and lead. Training emphasized discipline and patience. New Hellcat pilots learned quickly that their 650s gave them overwhelming firepower, but only if used correctly. The temptation was to open fire at maximum range, spraying bullets and hoping for hits. Experienced pilots knew better. Get close, wait for 400 yards or less, center the target in the gun sight. One decisive burst. The closer you got, the more concentrated your fire pattern, the less ammunition you wasted, and the higher your probability of a kill. One battle-tested rule circulated through every fighter squadron. If you're firing from beyond 400 yards, you're burning ammunition. If you're firing from 200 yards or closer, you're killing aircraft. This philosophy of concentrated, close-range firepower would prove devastatingly effective in the Pacific, where Hellcats would achieve a 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. But few anticipated that the same weapon system, designed to destroy lightweight Zeros and Vals over tropical islands, would face an entirely different challenge in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. A challenge that came wrapped in the distinctive radial engine silhouette of Kurt Tank's masterpiece, the Focke-Wulf 190, the German counter-September 1941. Over the pastoral fields of northern France, a formation of supermarine Spitfire Mark V's encounters something new. Something that shouldn't exist according to every intelligence report in Royal Air Force files. A compact, brutish-looking fighter with a radial engine that, impossibly, is out-turning, out-diving, and outgunning the legendary Spitfire. Within minutes, 2 Spitfires are falling in flames. The rest scatter, their pilots frantically radioing warnings about an unidentified enemy aircraft that has just rewritten the hierarchy of air superiority over Europe. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 Werger, nicknamed Shrike, represented everything the Messerschmitt Bf-109 wasn't. Where the 109 was sleek and streamlined around its inline Daimler-Benz engine, the 190 was built around the massive BMW 801 radial, 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, pumping out 1,800 horsepower. The Germans had looked at American designs like the P-47 Thunderbolt and realized that radial engines, properly installed, could deliver exceptional performance without the vulnerable cooling systems of liquid-cooled power plants. One well-placed round through a coolant line could kill an inline engine in minutes. The radial just kept running. Kurt Tank's design team at Focke-Wulf prioritized pilot survivability and combat effectiveness over pure performance figures. The 190 featured wide-track landing gear that made carrier-style precision landings unnecessary. A spacious cockpit with excellent visibility through a bubble canopy. Relatively light control forces that reduced pilot fatigue during extended combat. And most critically, a weapons package designed around a very specific combat philosophy. Kill the enemy quickly, before they can react or escape. The early FW-190A1 variant, entering service in summer 1941, carried what seemed like modest armament by later standards. Two 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns in the fuselage cowling, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, and two wing root-mounted 20mm MG-FF cannon. Total of 4 guns. On paper, this appeared inferior to contemporary fighters carrying 6 or 8 machine guns, but raw gun count was misleading. The MG-FF fired explosive shells weighing approximately 4.5 ounces, each one equivalent to a small grenade. A single 20mm hit could blow off a control surface, destroy an engine, or kill a pilot. 2 or 3 hits were usually enough to down any fighter. German pilots and ground crews quickly identified the inadequacy of the A-1's armament against heavy bombers that would soon appear in growing numbers over Europe. The solution arrived with the A-2 and subsequent variants, which progressively upgraded the 190's firepower. The MG-FF cannon were replaced with the superior Mauser MG-151/20, a faster-firing belt-fed weapon with better ballistics and reliability. The cowl-mounted MG-17 seconds were eventually upgraded to 13mm MG-131 machine guns, providing both anti-fighter and anti-bomber capability. By 1943, the standard FW-190A6 carried two 13mm MG-131 machine guns in the upper fuselage with 475 rounds per gun and two MG-151/20 20mm cannon in the wing roots with 250 rounds per gun. Some variants added additional cannon pods under the wings, bringing total armament to 6 guns, with 4 of them firing explosive shells. This was the bomber-destroyer configuration, designed specifically to break up formations of B-17 flying, fortresses, and B-24 liberators. The weight of fire from 4 20mm cannon could saw a heavy bomber's wing off in seconds. The Americans had nothing comparable. US fighters had abandoned cannon armament in favor of machine gun batteries, a doctrinal decision driven by reliability concerns and ammunition supply logistics. The .50 caliber Browning was mechanically simpler, more reliable in extreme conditions, and used ammunition that was easier to manufacture and transport across vast oceanic distances. Cannon were powerful but temperamental. The 20mm Hispano cannon mounted on P-38 Lightnings and some P-51 Mustangs had a reputation for jamming at the worst possible moments. The Germans, fighting closer to their manufacturing bases, could tolerate more complex weapons systems. But firepower was only part of the equation. What made the FW-190 particularly dangerous was its integration of weapons with tactics. German fighter doctrine emphasized the high-side attack, diving on enemy formations from above and behind, using gravity to increase closing speed while presenting a difficult deflection angle for defensive gunners. The 190's excellent roll rate allowed pilots to quickly adjust their approach angle during the dive, making defensive fire even harder to coordinate. Against fighters, the 190 employed boom and zoom tactics: gain altitude, spot the enemy, dive at high speed, fire a quick burst at close range, use momentum to climb back to altitude before the enemy can react. Never turn, fight. Never give a more maneuverable opponent the chance to get onto your tail. The 190 wasn't built to dogfight. It was built to kill quickly and escape before retaliation. This tactical philosophy worked brilliantly in Europe, where Luftwaffe pilots could choose when and where to engage, diving from 20,000 feet or higher, taking their shots, and disengaging at will. The aircraft's armament reflected this doctrine. The 13mm machine guns had a high rate of fire, approximately 900 rounds per minute combined, excellent for slashing attacks against fighter targets. The 20mm cannon, while slower firing at roughly 600 rounds per minute combined, delivered devastating punch. In a typical attack pass lasting 2 to 3 seconds, a FW-190 pilot could put 10 to 15 20mm shells and 40 to 50 machine gun rounds into a target area. If those rounds connected, the target didn't survive. One Luftwaffe pilot, later interviewed by Allied intelligence, described the sensation of firing the 190's full armament. The entire aircraft shudders. You feel it through the stick, through your seat, through your whole body. The nose wants to pitch down from the recoil. You're trained to anticipate this, to hold slight back pressure on the stick during firing. When you see your shells strike home, the satisfaction is immediate. No multiple passes needed. One good burst and you're moving to the next target. This philosophy created a profound psychological advantage. Allied pilots knew that if a FW-190 got a clean shot, you were probably dead. The combination of heavy armament, high diving speed, and excellent pilot visibility meant that German pilots could execute attacks with confidence, knowing their weapons could finish fights quickly. The 190 developed a fearsome reputation, particularly among bomber crews who watched these compact fighters bore in through walls of defensive machine gun fire, shrugging off hits that would down lesser aircraft, delivering accurate cannon fire that turned bombers into falling pyres. By May 1944, when British escort carriers began operations off the Norwegian coast, the FW-190 had evolved into multiple specialized variants. The A8, the most common fighter version, carried the standard armament of two 13mm guns and four 20mm cannon. The F-series focused on ground attack, with reinforced fuselage armor and underwing bomb racks. The G-series specialized in anti-shipping strikes. And a small number of D-series aircraft featured inline Junkers Jumo engines for improved high-altitude performance. All of them shared certain characteristics that made them formidable opponents: robust construction that could absorb significant battle damage, powerful engines that provided excellent performance below 20,000 feet, heavy armament capable of destroying targets with short, accurate bursts, and pilots who, even this late in the war, retained enough experience and skill to make these advantages count. When Jagjeshwada 5 intercepted British fleet operations off Norway in spring 1944, their pilots fully expected to drive off the attackers. They'd done it before, over the Channel, over Germany, over the Eastern Front. What they hadn't anticipated was meeting an aircraft they'd never trained to fight, an enemy that carried more guns, more ammunition, and different tactics than anything they'd encountered. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm had equipped several squadrons with American-built German Hellcats under the Lend-Lease program, and these aircraft were now flying cover for strike missions against the battleship Tirpitz and coastal shipping. To German pilots accustomed to fighting Hurricanes, Spitfires, and occasional P-38 seconds, the appearance of stubby, radial engine fighters displaying FAA roundels raised questions that would be answered in the worst possible way, measured in the 12 seconds it took for 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns at 400 yards range to reduce a combat veteran pilot and his million Reichsmark fighter into smoking debris, settling into the post. Frigid Norwegian Sea. The mathematics of violence. The physics of aerial combat at 400 yards reduced to a simple equation. Time to target, multiplied by rate of fire, multiplied by hit probability, equals either survival or oblivion. For a German pilot in a Focke-Wulf 190 facing a Hellcat, these numbers create a problem with no good solution. A FW-190A8 approaching a Hellcat at a combined closure rate of 450 miles per hour covers 400 yards in approximately 1.8 seconds. That's the window. Less than 2 heartbeats from the moment the American pilot acquires a firing solution until the German either escapes, destroys his target, or dies trying. In those 1.8 seconds, the Hellcat's 6 Brownings, firing at a combined rate of approximately 4,800 rounds per minute, can put 144 rounds into the air. The 190's armament, 2 13mm guns, and 2 or 4 20mm cannon, manages roughly 40 rounds total in the same time frame. The disparity isn't just numerical, it's philosophical. The German weapons system prioritizes individual projectile lethality. Each 20mm high-explosive shell carries enough punch to cripple most aircraft with a single hit. The 13mm rounds, while less powerful, can still destroy critical components. But this philosophy demands accuracy. Miss with your limited number of high-value projectiles, and you've accomplished nothing except revealing your position. The American philosophy is mathematical saturation. Put enough rounds downrange and probability guarantees hits. The .50 caliber API rounds may not have the raw destructive power of 20mm HE shells, but 60 or 70 of them arriving simultaneously will dismantle any aircraft ever built. Then there's the convergence issue. The Hellcat's 6 guns, harmonized to meet at 400 yards, create what pilots called a cone of destruction. Inside that cone, roughly 6 feet in diameter, every cubic foot of space has multiple bullet trajectories passing through it. An aircraft flying through that cone doesn't dodge individual bullets. It flies into a solid wall of metal moving at 2,800 feet per second. The laws of geometry make evasion nearly impossible once you're inside the pattern. The few 190s guns, mounted in the nose and wing roots, converge differently. The 2 fuselage guns fire straight ahead. The wing-mounted cannon converge at ranges typically set between 200 and 300 yards for fighter combat, closer for bomber interception. This creates a tighter but smaller beaten zone, higher concentration, smaller area. It works beautifully if you can maneuver into perfect firing position, but if the target is also maneuvering, also shooting, and putting 10 times as many projectiles into your flight path, perfect position becomes an academic concept you don't live long enough to achieve. Combat veterans on both sides understood this dynamic instinctively. German pilots learned quickly that engaging a Hellcat required perfect execution. Get the altitude advantage. Execute the dive with precise timing. Fire at close range, inside 200 yards where your cannon's superior individual lethality compensates for lower volume. And disengage immediately, using speed and the 190's excellent roll rate to break contact before the American can reverse the engagement. Any deviation from this script, any hesitation or error in timing, and those 6 Brownings would have their word. But theory and practice diverge violently when tracer rounds start burning through the air around your canopy. The human nervous system, evolved to process threats moving at animal speeds, simply cannot keep up with aerial combat at hundreds of miles per hour. You see muzzle flashes. You feel your aircraft shudder from nearby impacts. Your brain screams conflicting commands. Tighten the turn. No. Roll out. Dive. Climb. Fire back. Evade. Get out now. In those moments, training either holds or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, 12 seconds is an eternity of terror. The Norwegian engagement, May 8, 1944. 1,347 hours local time. HMS Emperor, a Lend-Lease escort carrier originally built as the USS Carnegie, pitches gently in North Sea, swells 35 miles west of the Norwegian coastline. On her flight deck, 12 Grumman Hellcats from 800 Squadron and 804 Squadron wait for launch. Their mission is straightforward. Escort a strike package targeting German coastal shipping, provide fighter cover, and intercept any Luftwaffe response. Intelligence suggests minimal opposition. Intelligence is wrong. Jagdgeschwader 5, stationed at Bardufoss, has been tracking the British task force since dawn. The Germans know exactly where the carriers are, what they're carrying, and when they'll launch. 24 Bf-109Gs and FW-190. As scramble at 1,335 hours, climbing to altitude over the Norwegian mountains before turning west toward the coast. They have time, altitude, and numerical superiority. The plan is textbook. Wait for the British strike aircraft to commit to their attack run, then bounce the escorts from above while they're distracted. Shoot down enough fighters to break the defensive screen, then savage the vulnerable torpedo bombers and dive bombers. The Hellcats launch at 1,340 hours. Standard combat air patrol formation, sections of 4 aircraft stacked at different altitudes from 8,000 to 15,000 feet. Lieutenant Blythe Ritchie, flying as section leader in 800 Squadron, has 3.5 previous victories to his credit, all scored in Hawker Sea Hurricanes during Mediterranean operations in 1942. He's experienced enough to know that escorts over Norway face veteran Luftwaffe pilots flying excellent aircraft, but he's also flying a Hellcat for the first time in a European theatre combat operation, and neither he nor his wingmen fully understand what that means yet. At 1,402 hours, radar operators aboard Emperor detect incoming contacts at 22,000 feet, bearing 090, distance 12 miles. The Hellcat formations vector toward the contacts, climbing hard. At 8,000 feet, Ritchie's flight is at a severe altitude disadvantage. The Germans are directly above them, with perfect position for a diving attack. What happens next unfolds in seconds, but violates every expectation the Luftwaffe pilots carry into the engagement. The lead German formation, 6 FW-190s from JG5, rolls inverted and dives. Their tactical manual says dive speed should reach 500 miles per hour or more to minimize exposure time to defensive fire. The pilots have executed this maneuver hundreds of times against Hurricanes, Spitfires, even the occasional American P-38. They know the mathematics. In a high-speed dive, most fighters can't track fast enough to get an effective firing solution. You scream past, firing a quick burst, then use your momentum to zoom climb back to altitude before the enemy can react. Simple, effective, proven. Ritchie sees them coming. Standard doctrine says turn into the attack, force the attacker to adjust his approach angle, spoil his firing solution. But the Hellcat has one advantage the Hurricane never had: power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp hammers out 2,000 horsepower, enough to sustain a tight turn while maintaining speed. Ritchie doesn't turn away. He turns into the diving Germans, slightly nose up, creating a pure deflection shot opportunity. The lead FW-190 commits. His pilot has done this exact attack profile 47 times. 41 of those times, he's either scored kills or forced the target to break off. He centers the Hellcat in his Revi-C 12D gun sight, range 600 yards, closing fast, 500, 400. Fire. Two things happen simultaneously. The Germans' 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns unleash their burst. Approximately 35 rounds total, a mix of armor-piercing and high explosive. At the same instant, Ritchie's thumb mashes the firing button mounted on his control stick. 6 Browning AN-M2S roar to life. The Germans' rounds pass through the space where the Hellcat would have been if Ritchie hadn't pulled a split-second harder turn. 2 rounds strike. One 13mm impacts the port wing's leading edge, penetrating aluminum skin but missing the internal spar. One 20mm grazes the tail, taking a chunk out of the rudder but causing no critical damage. The Hellcat shudders but keeps flying. The Hellcat's rounds don't miss. At 400 yards range, with both aircraft in motion, deflection shooting becomes an exercise in statistical inevitability. 100 rounds fired in a 1.5-second burst. The convergence pattern, carefully harmonized on the ground at Hatston Airfield in the Orkney Islands, creates a beaten zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. The Focke-Wulf, with a wingspan of 32.5 feet and length of 29 feet, presents a target area of approximately 100 square feet when viewed from a 45-degree aspect angle. 17 rounds connect. The difference between 17 and 0 is aircraft construction philosophy. The FW-190, despite its reputation for ruggedness, is still fundamentally a lightweight fighter built around a large engine. Aluminum skin over aluminum framework, designed to be light enough for a BMW 801 radial to push to competitive performance figures. The armor protection focuses on the cockpit and engine, leaving wings and control surfaces relatively vulnerable. Of those 17 hits, 4 are immediately catastrophic. 2 armor-piercing incendiary rounds punch through the port wing's upper surface, penetrating the main fuel tank. The incendiary compound ignites fuel vapor. The resulting explosion blows the entire wing section outboard of the landing gear clean off the airframe. 1 API round strikes the engine cowling, penetrating cooling fins, and detonating inside the oil cooler. Superheated. Oil sprays across hot metal. Fire erupts. 1 round, pure bad luck from the German pilot's perspective, comes through the bottom of the fuselage and severs the control cables to the elevator trim. The Focke-Wulf, suddenly minus half its lift surface and fully engulfed in flames, does what physics demands. It snap rolls to port and begins tumbling. The pilot, assuming he's still conscious after the violence of the initial impacts, has perhaps 2 seconds to recognize his situation and decide whether ejection is possible. The FW-190 doesn't have an ejection seat. Bailout requires manually jettisoning the canopy and climbing out against 6 or 7 GS of force from the tumble. By the time he makes the decision, the aircraft has already dropped through 5,000 feet and is accelerating toward the ocean below. Impact occurs at 1,403 hours and 18 seconds, approximately 40 seconds after the German pilot began his attack run. The FW-190 hits the North Sea at an estimated 400 miles per hour and a 30-degree angle. The aircraft disintegrates on contact. Debris spreads across 200 yards of churning water. There is no parachute. There is no survivor. Ritchie doesn't watch the impact. He's already reversing his turn, searching for the next threat. His wingman calls out 2 more contacts, diving from high altitude. The engagement continues. From the German pilot's perspective, what just happened shouldn't be possible. The tactical doctrine, validated through 3 years of combat on multiple fronts, says high-speed diving attacks work. They work because defensive fighters can't track fast enough. They work because the attacker controls the engagement geometry. They work because 35 rounds of mixed cannon and machine gun fire, properly placed, will destroy or cripple any single-engine fighter ever built. But doctrine is written based on fighting Hurricanes, Spitfires, Yak 3 seconds, and LaGG 3 seconds. None of those aircraft carry 6.50 caliber machine guns harmonized for maximum lethality at 400 yards. None of them have 2,400 rounds of ammunition, allowing their pilots to fire aggressive, sustained bursts without immediately running dry. And critically, none of them have the power-to-weight ratio that lets a Hellcat maintain both maneuverability and speed simultaneously during defensive maneuvers. The 12 seconds referenced in the engagement isn't arbitrary. It's derived from actual combat analysis. At typical engagement speeds, a German fighter pilot has approximately 12 seconds from the moment a Hellcat acquires a firing solution until his aircraft either escapes the cone of fire or gets shredded by it. 12 seconds to execute perfect evasive maneuvers while simultaneously trying to return fire accurately enough to disable the threat. 12 seconds where every mistake is final. Those 12 seconds break down into distinct phases. Seconds 1 through 3, recognition. The attacking pilot sees tracer rounds, processes that he's being fired upon, and begins evasive action. Seconds 4 through 7, maneuver. Roll, dive, climb, whatever combination offers the best chance of breaking the firing solution while minimizing exposure time. Seconds 8 through 11, counterattack or escape. Either reverse the geometry and get your own guns on target, or disengage entirely and pray your aircraft holds together. Second 12, outcome. You're either clear, damaged but flying, or you're dead. The German pilots over Norway that day learned this mathematics the hard way. The engagement lasted 14 minutes and involved 48 aircraft total. When it ended, 3 German fighters were in the water, 2 Bf-109Gs and 1 FW-190. British losses: 1 Hellcat, shot down during the initial bounce before the defending fighters could establish position. 3-to-1 kill ratio in favor of the Hellcats, achieved despite altitude and numerical disadvantage. The after-action reports, declassified decades later, make for revealing reading. Multiple German pilots reported being shocked by the volume of defensive fire. One survivor stated he counted at least 6 separate tracer streams converging on his position during a single attack pass, forcing him to break off without firing. Another described watching a wingman's aircraft simply disintegrate under sustained fire, not exploding dramatically, but coming apart in pieces, as accumulated structural damage exceeded the airframe's ability to hold together. The British pilots, for their part, reported surprise at how quickly German fighters went down once solid hits were achieved. Hellcat pilots accustomed to shooting at lightly built Zeros and Kates expected similar results against European fighters. What they discovered was that while the FW-190 was more robust than Japanese aircraft, it couldn't withstand the cumulative effect of multiple 50 caliber API strikes any better than anything else made of aluminum and gasoline. The cost of tactical evolution. The Norwegian engagement marked one of only a handful of times Hellcats faced Luftwaffe fighters in direct combat. Most Hellcat operations in the European theatre focused on ground attack and anti-shipping missions, where the aircraft's substantial ordnance capacity proved more valuable than its air-to-air capability. But those few encounters provided valuable data that would influence fighter design and doctrine for decades. The primary lesson was about firepower philosophy. The German approach, fewer guns with more powerful individual projectiles, worked brilliantly against bombers and in situations where the attacking pilot could establish perfect firing position. But against agile fighters flown by competent pilots, perfect position was a theoretical construct rarely achieved in reality. The American approach, maximum projectile volume combined with longer engagement range, proved more adaptable to the chaos of actual combat. You might not get the perfect shot, but you could get an adequate shot more often, and adequate shots delivered in sufficient volume produced kills. The secondary lesson involved aircraft design priorities. The FW-190's reputation for ruggedness wasn't undeserved. The aircraft could absorb significant damage and continue flying, but that durability had limits. Once you exceeded the airframe's ability to maintain structural integrity, focused on protecting the pilot and engine, the rest of the aircraft became vulnerable. The Hellcat's design philosophy, accepting greater overall weight in exchange for protection distributed throughout the aircraft, proved more survivable in sustained combat. By June 1944, when Hellcats returned to the Norwegian theatre for additional operations, Luftwaffe tactics had evolved. German pilots avoided head-on or crossing shots against Hellcats, preferring to engage from behind where the American aircraft's firepower advantage mattered less. They broke off attacks earlier, not pressing home if the defending fighters established good position. And they prioritized attacking strike aircraft over escorts, accepting that fighting the Hellcats directly was a poor trade-off of resources. This tactical adaptation, born from encounters over the North Sea, validated what American pilots had already learned in the Pacific. The Hellcat wasn't the fastest fighter, wasn't the most maneuverable, wasn't the longest ranged or highest climbing, but it was the most consistently lethal at the ranges where most air combat actually occurred. 400 yards, 3 seconds of trigger time, 120 rounds downrange. That combination killed aircraft reliably, regardless of whether the target was a lightly built Zero or a heavily armed Focke-Wulf. Legacy in metal and mathematics. The F6F Hellcat ended World War II with 5,156 aerial victories credited to Navy and Marine Corps pilots, representing 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air kills during the war. The 19-to-1 kill ratio achieved in the Pacific theater remains one of the most lopsided combat records in aviation history. Even accounting for the declining quality of Japanese pilots and aircraft as the war progressed, the numbers are extraordinary. The European theater numbers, while statistically insignificant due to limited Hellcat deployment, tell a similar story. British Fleet Air Arm Hellcats engaged German aircraft on multiple occasions between April 1944 and May 1945. They claimed victories against Bf-109s, FW-190s, Ju-88s, He-111s, and He-115 floatplanes. Losses in air-to-air combat totaled 3 aircraft. The exchange ratio, even against veteran Luftwaffe pilots flying excellent aircraft, favored the Hellcat decisively. The secret wasn't revolutionary technology. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 was a solid but not exceptional engine. The airframe was competent but unremarkable. The flight controls were conventional. What made the Hellcat special was the integration of 6 Browning A&M-2 machine guns into a stable, powerful platform flown by well-trained pilots who understood how to maximize their weapon system's advantages. That weapon system, those 650s in their wing mounts with their 400 rounds each and their carefully harmonized convergence, represented a specific answer to a specific problem. How do you reliably destroy enemy aircraft at combat ranges with the technology available in 1942? The answer was mathematical. Maximize rate of fire, maximize ammunition capacity, optimize convergence for typical engagement distances, and then train pilots to get close enough for the mathematics to work. The Germans had different answers to the same problem: heavy cannon capable of one-shot kills, excellent high-speed performance for diving attacks, pilot training emphasizing precision marksmanship. These answers worked brilliantly in many contexts. But against an opponent who could put 70 rounds into your flight path every second, Precision became less relevant than volume, and high speed only mattered if you could complete your attack before those rounds arrived. The mathematics were unforgiving. A FW-190 pilot at 400 yards range from a Hellcat, traveling at 450 miles per hour closure rate, had 1.8 seconds to fire his weapons and disengage before entering the beaten zone. In those 1.8 seconds, he could deliver approximately 20 rounds total from his combined armament. The Hellcat, in the same time frame, delivered 144 rounds, 7-to-1 numerical superiority in projectiles, independent of individual round effectiveness. If the German pilot got his shot off perfectly, hitting critical components with his limited number of high-value rounds, the Hellcat went down. This happened. Combat losses prove it. But if the German pilot's aim was even slightly off, if his timing was imperfect, if the Hellcat pilot maneuvered unexpectedly, those 20 rounds missed and accomplished nothing. The Hellcat's 144 rounds didn't require perfect aim. They required adequate aim across a 6-foot beaten zone. Probability theory did the rest. The numbers that mattered post-war analysis by both American and German researchers attempted to quantify the effectiveness of various fighter armament schemes. The data, compiled from gun camera footage, pilot reports, and examination of wreckage, reveals patterns that validate the Hellcat's design philosophy. Average rounds expended per aerial victory varied significantly by armament type. P-51 Mustangs with 6 .50 caliber guns averaged approximately 800 rounds per kill. P-47 Thunderbolts with 8 .50 caliber guns averaged around 600 rounds per kill. Hellcats with 6 .50 caliber guns averaged approximately 900 rounds per kill. The higher number for Hellcats likely reflects the more maneuverable targets they typically engaged, particularly Zeros capable of extreme evasive action. German fighters with cannon-heavy armament showed different patterns. FW-190s averaged approximately 120 rounds total expenditure per kill, including both machine gun and cannon rounds. This dramatically lower number reflects the one-shot kill capability of 20mm HE shells, but it also reflects selection bias. Only kills were analysed. Aircraft that escaped after being hit but not destroyed weren't included in the data. When researchers examined overall ammunition expenditure versus engagement outcomes, German fighters showed much higher total rounds fired per sortie, with lower hit percentages compared to American fighters. The practical implication was mission effectiveness. A Hellcat pilot with 2,400 rounds could engage multiple targets per sortie, firing aggressive bursts without immediately depleting ammunition. A FW-190 pilot with 500 machine gun rounds and 500 cannon rounds had to be far more conservative, often limiting himself to 1 or 2 serious engagement attempts before returning to base to rearm. This difference in combat persistence translated directly to battlefield effectiveness, particularly during critical phases of carrier operations when continuous fighter cover was essential. Maintenance requirements also factored into operational effectiveness. The Browning M2 was mechanically simple, with relatively few moving parts and tolerance for field conditions. Carrier squadron armament crews could maintain and troubleshoot the guns with basic tools and minimal technical support. Cannon, particularly the MG-151/20 and Mk-108, required more specialized maintenance and were more sensitive to rough handling and extreme conditions. This made them problematic for carrier operations where space and specialized support equipment were limited. The reliability difference showed in operational readiness rates. Hellcat squadrons typically maintained 80 to 90% of their aircraft combat ready at any given time, with weapons malfunctions accounting for less than 5% of maintenance issues. German fighter units, particularly those operating cannon-heavy aircraft, reported readiness rates closer to 60 to 70%, with weapons system failures representing a significantly larger portion of non-operational status. These numbers, dry and statistical in isolation, represent lives and outcomes. Every percentage point of reliability meant pilots who went into combat confident their weapons would function. Every additional round of ammunition meant engagement opportunities that would have been passed up with lighter weapon loads. Every second of sustained fire capability meant targets that didn't escape to fight another day. The echo through time. The Hellcat's service life ended rapidly after World War II. Jet aircraft rendered piston-engine fighters obsolete almost overnight. By 1950, most Hellcats had been retired to training units or converted to unmanned drones for missile testing. But the lessons learned from the aircraft's combat employment continued to influence fighter design for decades. The concept of balanced firepower, combining volume and lethality, became a fundamental principle in subsequent American fighter development. The F-86 Sabre, first-generation jet fighter, carried 6 .50-caliber Brownings, essentially the same armament as the Hellcat. The arrangement proved effective in Korea, where Sabres achieved favorable kill ratios against MiG-15 seconds despite arguably inferior aircraft performance. When designers eventually moved to cannon armament with the F-4 Phantom and beyond, they maintained the multi-gun philosophy, mounting multiple 20mm Vulcan rotary cannon capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute. The 400-yard convergence concept, refined through Hellcat operations, became standard doctrine. Modern fighter gun systems, still designed for effective ranges of 400 to 600 meters, the metric equivalent of the Hellcat's optimal engagement distance. Fire control systems, vastly more sophisticated than World War II reflector sights, still calculate deflection solutions to place projectiles at that range band where ballistics, closure rate, and target size create maximum hit probability. The German lessons learned from facing Hellcats also propagated forward. Post-war Luftwaffe analysis, conducted by surviving pilots and technical staff, identified the American volume fire approach as superior for typical combat conditions. When West Germany rebuilt its air force in the 1950s, they adopted mixed armament schemes, combining cannon with machine guns, but emphasized ammunition capacity and sustained firing capability rather than individual projectile lethality. The Soviet Union, analyzing the same data through captured documents and interrogation of German personnel, reached similar conclusions. Their post-war fighters typically carried multiple cannon with substantial ammunition loads, accepting greater weight to ensure engagement persistence. The Browning, .50 caliber itself, remained in military service well into the 21st century. The same basic design that armed Hellcats in 1944 arms, helicopters, vehicles, and even some modern aircraft. The M2 HB ground variant and M3 aircraft variant continue production, with millions of units manufactured. Few weapon systems in history can claim operational relevance spanning a century, but John Moses Browning's design achieved exactly that. The fundamental mechanism, recoil-operated, air-cooled, belt-fed, firing a powerful cartridge with proven effectiveness against various targets, never needed replacement. It needed only refinement and adaptation to new platforms. The 12-second problem that German pilots faced over Norway in 1944 has modern equivalents. Contemporary fighter pilots calculate similar time-to-kill windows, measured in fractions of seconds rather than double-digit seconds, but the underlying mathematics remain unchanged. Volume of fire, rate of fire, hit probability, and target vulnerability combine to create engagement windows, where one side has overwhelming advantage. Modern systems use radar-guided missiles and computer-aimed guns, but they solve the same problem. Deliver lethal force to a moving target before the target delivers lethal force to you. The engagement window has compressed. Modern air-to-air missiles reach targets in seconds. Gun systems fire thousands of rounds per minute, but the principle established by the Hellcat's 6 Brownings remains valid. Whoever puts the most lethal projectiles on target in the available time window wins the engagement. Technology changes. Physics doesn't. Conclusion, May 8, 1944. A Focke-Wulf 190 falls into the North Sea, carrying with it a pilot who never understood what killed him. Not incompetence, not bad luck, not inferior equipment. What killed him was mathematics. The simple, brutal calculus of rate of fire multiplied by time, multiplied by hit probability. The Germans brought cannon and precision. The Americans brought volume and coverage. In the specific conditions of that engagement, volume won. The broader lesson transcends the specific aircraft. The Hellcat wasn't successful because it was the best fighter of World War II by any single metric. It was successful because it was optimized for the actual conditions of carrier-based combat in the Pacific, and those same optimizations translated effectively to limited European operations. Other fighters were faster, more agile, better at high altitude, longer ranged, but none were more reliably lethal at the ranges where most combat occurred. The 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, harmonized to converge at 400 yards, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds from 2,400-round ammunition pools, represented a specific solution to a specific problem. That solution worked. It worked against lightly built Japanese aircraft. It worked against heavily armed German fighters. It worked because the mathematics of probability and the physics of concentrated firepower don't care about the target's nationality or construction philosophy. They only care about delivering projectiles to space occupied by enemy aircraft. For German pilots who encountered Hellcats in 1944 and 1945, the experience was educational and often fatal. They learned that their tactical doctrine, proven effective against British and Soviet aircraft, had blind spots. They learned that volume of fire could compensate for individual projectile lethality. They learned that 12 seconds was simultaneously an eternity and nowhere near enough time. Some survived the lesson. Many didn't. The North Sea, the Norwegian coast, and the scattered wreckage across a dozen European battlefields testify to the cost of that education. The Hellcat's combat record, 19-1 in the Pacific, and consistently favourable even in limited European operations, speaks to effective integration of weapon systems, aircraft performance, and pilot training. But at its core, the record reflects something simpler. 6 guns, 400 yards, 12 seconds. Get those 3 elements aligned, and physics handles the rest. The enemy aircraft doesn't dodge, doesn't absorb, doesn't escape. It just stops flying and falls. That's the legacy. Not the most famous fighter of World War II. Not the most glamorous. Not the fastest or prettiest. Just the most reliably lethal when pilots needed aircraft destroyed quickly and certainly. The Focke-Wulf pilots who died over Norway learned that lesson in the final seconds of their lives. The ones who survived carried it forward, adapting tactics and procedures to avoid giving American fighters those 12-second windows. But adaptation only goes so far. Once the Hellcat had a firing solution at 400 yards or less, geometry and ballistics took over. What happened next was mathematical, predictable, and final. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.